"You're going to love it here, I promise," Rachel said, her voice a little too bright, trying to fill the silence that had stretched between them since they left the city limits. The car's headlights painted the narrow, winding road with a feeble glow, the surrounding darkness seemingly eager to swallow it back up. "It's so quiet," Mark murmured, his eyes scanning the thick tree line that hugged the side of the road like a cloak of secrets. Rachel nodded, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Yeah, it's a real escape from the city noise. Just wait until you see the house. It's like a slice of history, all to ourselves." The old cottage, Rachel had assured him, was a steal. It had been in her family for generations, nestled deep in the woods, where the only neighbors were the whispers of the leaves and the occasional howl of a lonely wolf. Mark had his doubts the pictures online looked a bit too much like the set of a B-grade horror movie, but Rachel's excitement was infectious. Plus, they needed a break from their cramped apartment and the constant din of traffic outside their window. The house appeared in the distance, a shadowy figure standing tall amidst a clearing, its windows glinting in the moonlight like the eyes of a watchful predator. Rachel slowed the car, her hand tightening on the steering wheel. "Almost there," she murmured, more to herself than to Mark. The closer they got, the more he could make out the ivy that clung to the walls, the peeling paint, and the crooked porch swing that looked as though it hadn't seen a summer in years. The engine sputtered to a stop in the gravel driveway. Rachel killed the lights, plunging them into darkness. "Let's go," she said, her voice a shaky echo. "Welcome home, Mark." The door groaned open, protesting the years of disuse. Rachel fumbled for the light switch, her hand brushing against the dusty wallpaper. The lights flickered to life, revealing a living room that had been frozen in time, or so it seemed. The furniture was covered in white sheets that ghostly outlines of armchairs and side tables. A grandfather clock ticked solemnly in the corner, as if counting down the seconds to their doom. "It's charming," Mark forced a smile, trying not to let his unease show. Rachel's enthusiasm had wilted like a forgotten bouquet of flowers. "Needs a bit of work, but it has potential." They made their way through the house, Rachel pointing out the quaint details that she had so fondly remembered from her childhood summers spent here. The creaking floorboards, the smell of dust and decay, the way the shadows danced on the walls, it was all eerily familiar to her. But there was something else here too, something she hadn't mentioned to Mark. A presence that didn't quite fit with the nostalgic picture she had painted for him. As they reached the staircase, Rachel's heart began to race. She hadn't been upstairs in years, not since that last summer. The one she didn't talk about. The one that had left her with the feeling of being watched, even when she was alone. "You take the first room on the left," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll grab the one across the hall." Mark nodded, his eyes darting around the gloomy space. The air was thick with a sense of unease that he couldn't quite place. He climbed the stairs, each step echoing through the empty house. At the top, the hallway stretched before him, lined with closed doors that seemed to lean in slightly, as if whispering secrets to one another. He pushed open the door to his room, the hinges shrieking like an unseen specter. The moonlight streamed through the gap in the curtains, casting a cold, pale light over the dusty floorboards. Rachel's footsteps faded down the hall as she disappeared into her room. The house was so quiet. It was as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. The first creak came from the floorboards above them, a soft protest against the weight of an invisible footstep. Rachel froze, her hand hovering over the light switch in the hallway. "It's just the house settling," she said, her voice barely audible. Mark nodded, but the tightness in his jaw belied his fear. Once in his room, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. The moonlight played tricks on his eyes, making the shadows seem to stretch and contort. He tried to ignore the sensation, telling himself it was just his imagination. Rachel called out that she was going to grab some blankets from the storage room and disappeared down the hall, her footsteps swallowed by the darkness. The silence grew heavier, the ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs now a rhythmic heartbeat in the quiet. Mark took a deep breath and lay on the bed, pulling the dusty comforter up to his chin. The mattress felt hard and unforgiving, as though it had not been slept in for years. He closed his eyes, willing the comfort of sleep to come, but it remained elusive. It was the sound of Rachel's scream that jolted him upright. He bolted out of the room and into the hallway, his bare feet slapping against the cold wood. Her screams grew louder, more desperate, and he followed them to the back of the house. The storage room door was open, light spilling out into the hall, revealing Rachel standing in the doorway, a look of pure terror etched on her face. "What is it?" Mark shouted, his own heart racing. Rachel's eyes were wide, her breath coming in ragged gasps. There's something upstairs." The house seemed to respond to her words, the creaks and groans growing louder, more deliberate. And then, a chilling whisper floated down the staircase, a sound so faint that Mark wasn't sure he had heard it at all. Rachel's hand clutched his arm, her nails digging into his skin. "We need to leave," she whispered. But it was too late. The whisper grew into a cacophony, a symphony of unearthly voices that filled the house with a malevolent presence. The floorboards trembled under their feet, and a cold wind seemed to blow through the closed windows. Rachel's grip tightened, her eyes searching his for a semblance of control, of rationality. But Mark could only offer a shake of his head. They were not alone. Their escape was blocked by a figure that slowly descended the stairs, a ghostly silhouette outlined in the flickering candlelight from the living room. It was tall, almost too tall to be human, and as it grew closer, the details began to coalesce: long, spindly limbs, a face contorted in a silent scream, eyes that burned with a malevolent glow. Rachel's hand went slack, and she stumbled backward, her eyes wide with horror. The figure reached the bottom of the stairs, the floorboards groaning under its weight. It moved with a purposeful, unnatural grace, each step deliberate and filled with a sense of ancient malice. Mark felt his legs give out beneath him, his body paralyzed with fear. Rachel's hand found his again, cold and trembling. The ghost stopped before them, its gaze lingering on Rachel for a long, drawn-out moment. And then, with a sudden, violent motion, it raised its arms. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, and the whispers grew to a crescendo that seemed to pierce their very souls. Rachel's grip tightened, and she screamed again, the sound lost in the chaos. The house began to shake, the walls seemingly closing in around them. Mark's mind raced, trying to think of a way out, a way to save themselves from this nightmare that had come to life before their eyes. But the only thing he could focus on was Rachel's hand in his, and the desperate hope that somehow they would find a way through this together. And as the ghost took another step closer, the house let out a final, mournful groan. Rachel's eyes met Mark's, and in that instant he knew what they had to do. They had to face this terror, to confront the past that had lingered in these hallowed halls. With a deep breath, Rachel yanked Mark towards her, and together they turned to face the advancing specter. The creature's eyes bore into Rachel, and she felt the weight of its anger and pain. It was her secret, her burden to bear. The whispers grew louder, turning into a cacophony of wails that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Rachel stumbled, her knees buckling, but Mark held her up, his own fear giving way to a fierce determination to protect her. In a sudden burst of courage, Rachel spoke to the ghost, her voice shaking but firm. "What do you want from me?" she demanded. "I've paid for my mistakes. Leave us alone." The ghost's form flickered, the shadows playing across its twisted features, as though considering her words. For a moment, the house was still, the only sound the thunderous pounding of their hearts. And then, the ghost opened its mouth, a soundless scream echoing through the room. The air grew colder, icier, and Rachel felt a deep chill that penetrated her very core. The whispers grew softer, more urgent. They were telling her something, a story long forgotten. With trembling fingers, Rachel reached into her pocket and pulled out an old, tattered photograph. It was a picture of her and her sister, taken in this very house during that fateful summer. Rachel's eyes filled with tears as she held the image up to the ghost. "I remember you," she whispered. "I remember what happened." The ghost's form wavered, and Rachel could almost see the flicker of recognition. It took a step back, the pressure in the room lessening. Rachel took a shaky breath and stepped forward, extending the photograph. "Let us go," she pleaded. "We'll leave and never come back. Just let us go." The ghost hovered for a moment, as though contemplating her offer. Then, with a suddenness that made Mark's heart leap into his throat, it lunged. Rachel screamed and shoved the photo into the air between them, and the room exploded with light. When the brightness faded, the ghost was gone. The house was silent once more, the shadows no longer dancing on the walls. Rachel crumpled to the floor, sobbing into Mark's arms as he held her tight. But even in that moment of relief, a cold realization seeped into Mark's consciousness. The ghost had not disappeared, it had merely retreated. The house was still its domain, and Rachel's secret had not truly been laid to rest. The presence was still there, a constant reminder of what lurked beneath the surface of their quiet retreat. They packed their bags in a daze, leaving the old cottage behind them without a backward glance. The car's headlights cut through the inky night, illuminating the winding road that led back to the city. Rachel never spoke of what she had seen that summer, and Mark never asked. But as they drove away, both knew that the house in the woods had claimed a piece of them, a piece they could never escape. The story wasn't over, it had just begun a new, more haunting chapter.